So here we go. Tonight we are starting our brand new Bible study. We are going to be starting on a series that I'm calling Trust and Faith. And I'm trying, bear with me just a minute, guys. I'm trying to see the comment section because so far I cannot see it. So give me just a second. Pull it up on my other device so I can see you guys when you make comments or if I need to answer any questions. Ooh, 30 comments. Oh my goodness. Oh, nope, that was last week. Oh, that is it. All right, good guys. I'm going to have to just check on my phone every now and then because for some reason my comments aren't coming up on my computer. So thank you for everybody that's been patiently waiting on me while I've been waiting on you. But hey, such is technology. So here we go. As I said, we are starting our new Bible study tonight. I'm calling it Trust and Faith. And what's so funny is I had picked out this Bible study lesson a couple of weeks ago, or it's been probably close to 3 or 4 weeks ago now. Had definitely decided to do this, and that was before we went into all of this isolation and quarantining and social distancing and all of that. So, you know, it always feels great when everything works together like this because I know I was listening to God and God had a hand in this and picking this Bible study because how appropriate is it for now that we need this. We need to understand and do a faith check. We need to have a trust check on our relationship with God. So hopefully this lesson will help us out with that. And the reason I titled it Trust and Faith is in times of uncertainty like we're in right now, it can truly test our trust in God. It tests our trust of his timing. It tests our trust of his plans. It tests our trust that he's in control. And it also tests our faith. Is it going to strengthen our faith or is it going to lessen our faith? Throughout this study, of course, I'm going to be using the Bible primarily, but I'm also going to be using other resources like Lisa Turkhurst's books, It's Not Supposed to Be This Way, and Trustworthy, along with some other materials. We're going to be looking at people and situations in the Bible and how they responded to troubling times. So our first lesson involves Saul, and this is Saul of the Old Testament. He would become King Saul. And it comes from 1 Samuel, and we're going to start off in chapter 8. We're going to look at chapters 8, 9, and 10, some verses out of each one of those, and then we'll jump into chapter 13. But I'll let you know where we're at in case you didn't get the notes. Let me take a quick look at the comments, make sure we don't have any issues or anything. I think we're good. Okay. So we're going to start off 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we're going to be looking at verses 19 through 21. This is a time period in the Old Testament when Israel was still broken up into 4 tribes, the original 4 tribes of which were founded by or established through the 12 sons of Jacob, who was later named Israel. So these are the original 12 tribes. And there had been some battles that had happened, different conflicts that were happening throughout. And at this point, Israel, the people of Israel, has asked the prophet Samuel to intercede to God and said, we want a king. And we see Samuel has tried to reason with them and let them know that that's not the best idea. But we see in verse 19, he says, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Well, God hears, and when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord, and the Lord reluctantly agrees. He says in verse 22, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Big problem's about to happen. He said, this is what you want. I'm going to give it to you. Despite everything Samuel had told them, if you look back around verses 10 to about 18 is where all the warnings are. He's guys, look, guys, it's not going to be good. If you are under an earthly king, that king is truly going to take control of you, and it's not going to look good. And we see that happen even today. You constantly see the bickering back and forth of things are so bad, we need to elect new leaders. So maybe it's the Republicans, maybe it's the Democrats. We want a different society. We don't want a democratic society, we want a socialist society. No, we want capitalism. We want different systems. We want different laws. But instead of getting closer to our solution, which is God, of course, everybody following God's law, we're just creating more problems. And that has happened throughout history, and we see the start of it here when the Israelites are asking for an earthly king. So again, God reluctantly says, okay, that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And we see in the beginning of chapter 9 in verses 1 and 2 that God shows Samuel who he wants him to anoint for king. And it's a man from the tribe of Benjamin. This would have been the smallest of the 12 tribes. There was a member named Kish, and Kish had a son named Saul. And the description to really take note of is in verse 2, where he says, and he, Kish, had a son named Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. And I had to kind of laugh when because I can picture this long-necked guy, but he's just saying he was taller than everybody else. When he stood up, he was just truly head and shoulders physically above the rest. And we're going to come back to that and talk about why that was important and why that may have that particular trait may have been chosen. But if you flip over to chapter 10 and look at verses 1 and chapter 10 verse 1, you see where Samuel actually anoints Saul. It says, then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. And this shall be a sign to you that the Lord has anointed you to be prince over his heritage. And so now he's making it official. He's now anointed him. He's saying, look, you are truly now the king of these people. God has had his hand in it, and you are now king. And Samuel goes on to say, look, even if you don't take that seriously, I'm going to give you some signs so that you know this is true. And if you read you can read the details in chapter 10, verses 2 through 6. But basically he says, look, the first sign that you're going to see is you're going to encounter two men who are going to tell you where the donkeys are. Now, if you go back to the very beginning, chapter 7, chapter 8, you'll see where Saul had gone out looking for some lost donkeys. And that's when this whole process of Samuel telling him that he's going to be king. And he never found the donkeys at that point. He of course, he got sidetracked with being told he's going to be king. There was other stuff for him to do. But he says, look, you're going to find two men who are going to tell you, don't worry, the donkeys have been found. You need to go back home because your dad's worried about you. Secondly, you're going to encounter three men that are going to Bethel. One of those men's going to be carrying some goats, one's going to carry some loaf of breads, and the other one is going to have some wine. And thirdly, you're going to encounter some prophets, and they list these musical instruments that they're all playing. And the key thing there in verse 5 and 6, he said, you'll meet the group of prophets, and they're going to be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. A very key thing there, because he's telling him at that point, you're going to become a whole new man at this point. It wasn't just the anointing of the oil. It wasn't just these signs that I'm giving to you, but you have truly been chosen, and the Spirit of God is going to indwell among you. And the way the people were going to recognize it, because this was just an ordinary man, son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. He hadn't been through any priestly training at all. Remember, that was for the tribe of Levi. He said, you haven't been through any training. There's no reason for you to be a prophet or to be prophesying, but the Spirit of the Lord's going to come upon you and you're going to be prophesying. And you can see that the community's making comments down below. There's like, who is this man that's prophesying? Isn't this the Kish or Saul, the son of Kish? And they're just really dumbfounded by what's happened. But then there's the problem. So that gives you the background on how Saul got to the point he is right now. But the key verse in there where you see everything start going downhill for Saul is chapter 10 at the end of verse 8. He said, after you do that prophesying, after all that happens, I want you to go to the town of Gilgal. And when you get there, you're going to wait there for 7 days for me to get there. You're going to wait 7 days. I'll come to you and I'll show you and tell you what you need to do, because there's some battles brewing. The Philistines are sorry, that was the dogs coming in through the door. The Philistines are gearing up for battle. Israel's afraid. They don't know what's going to happen. They're wanting this king to defend them and save them from his enemies. But Samuel's saying, look, go to Gilgal. That's where I need you to hang out, and I'll tell you what to do. Now, we've all been in this quarantine. We've all been in social isolation. 7 days may not sound like a lot, but a lot of us are realizing that when you're stuck in place for 7 days and you're waiting on some good news, you're waiting for direction, it's tough. And so here's Saul, this new king, who's supposed to be protecting his people from their enemies. He's supposed to be their savior, not the godly savior, but he's going to protect and deliver those people from battle. He's sitting there waiting on Samuel to arrive. Now, during that time, we see later on in chapter 10, around verse, let's see, he goes in and he starts telling them, and this, you have to flip over to verse 13 to get to this point. But in chapter 13, around verse 5, you start seeing the problem with him waiting. The Philistines have already started the battle, and they're getting closer to the Israelites and the army. Men are starting to leave Saul's army. If you go down to verse 8 and then you go down to around verse 15, 16, somewhere in there, you find out that Saul is getting scared because his soldiers are leaving. And his army, which had originally been around 3,000 men, has dwindled down to about 600. So men are scattering because they're afraid. Samuel is not there to give direction. They're not sure if God's going to intercede for them. They're not sure what Saul is going to do. So they're starting to scatter. And so now Saul, he's afraid, and he's starting to have that sense of a loss of control. But he does wait the 7 days, but things just aren't going according to his plan, according to Saul's plan. And he, at this point, you can see that he is not going to wait a minute longer. Now, we don't know if he woke up bright and early the morning of that 7th day and says, oh, no, Samuel, and did this. Maybe he waited mid-morning. Maybe he waited till noon. We don't know. But he waited until the 7th day, and then he decided, look, things are not going according to plan. Things were going super fine when I had Samuel nearby. Samuel's not near anymore. I need to do this burnt offering and sacrifice so the Lord can give me some direction. So I'm just going to take control and do it myself. Anybody ever experienced that before, where you've just decided, I'm not getting the answer I want. It's not happening when I wanted it to. So I'm just going to go ahead and take control, and I'm going to solve this problem myself. And that's what he attempts to do. And we see in chapter 13, verse 10, that as soon as he makes that burnt offering and sacrifice, it says, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came And so Samuel couldn't have been that far away when Saul decided that he had had enough waiting and he was just going to make the sacrifice himself. And instead of humbling himself, instead of asking for forgiveness, instead of admitting that he was wrong, he starts to make excuses and he starts to try to justify what he's done. Make a comment over, drop a comment or an emoji or something if you've ever found yourself in this predicament. I'm seeing the, yep, I'm not going to answer that one. We have all been guilty of jumping ahead and trying to solve the problem instead of waiting. And then we get caught and we start to try to justify or make excuses for why we did that. And so we see Saul's excuses in verses 11 through 12. And you can read the details, but I'm going to give you what it says and then likely what he was thinking. First of all, he says, you didn't show up. In other words, I was expecting you to show up at a certain time and you didn't show up according to my timeline. So it's your fault because you didn't show up. Secondly, he says, people were leaving me. In other words, I was depending on my people more than I was going to depend on you and God. Thirdly, he says, look, the enemy was close. They were getting closer. I had to act right now. If I didn't do something right now, there was going to be a problem. So I had to do it. In other words, I was scared that you had left me too, and I was on my own. And fourthly, a sacrifice needed to be made, so I took care of it myself. In other words, I thought the sacrifice was what you really wanted, when what you and God really wanted was my obedience. Yeah, you can, not sure if he was starting to feel a little humble at that point, or if he was just in anger mode and he was truly intent on saying, I did what I had to do. And we see Samuel's response in verses 13 and the beginning of 14. He says, and Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. Pretty harsh. He disobeys. He doesn't follow the commands. He acts totally on his own. And Samuel calls him out for it. And it's not even, oh, you're going to get another chance. He said, it's done. You had your chance. We asked you to wait. You didn't. You went ahead with all this on your own. And now your kingdom is over. Your kingdom is not going to continue. So what can we learn from all that? First, I want us to go back to God's choice of Saul. If we go back to chapter 9 and we look at verse 2, we see that again where it said, and he had a son named Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the other people. Had God chosen someone based on their external qualities or their internal qualities at that point? He didn't mention anything about his beliefs. He didn't answer anything about behavior patterns. He didn't answer anything about who he worshiped. Nothing. All that's mentioned at this point about Saul is that he was handsome and taller than any of the other people. And that's definitely just an external quality. And we wonder then why God chose someone just for their external qualities. And we see when after Samuel had rebuked him, we look at verse back in chapter 13 in verse 14, and he says, and now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart And the Lord has commanded him to be a prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And so in that one, he says, my next choice is someone who is a man who is after his own heart. So now we see that he switched from an external quality to an internal quality for the next king. Why would God choose someone with external qualities as the first king instead of someone with internal qualities? Give that a thought for a second. Why would he choose for their first king someone that he chose because of the external qualities instead of the internal qualities he looked at for the next king? The people, if you think about it, for their first king, they were expecting a warrior. They were expecting someone that was going to defend them and to save them from their enemies. They wanted a person that looked like a warrior, head and shoulders above the rest, handsome, broad, fit, the strength, the whole 9 yards. And that's what they got with Saul, not someone like David, which we'll be studying next time. Does that description sound familiar? Here we are in the Holy Week. We're here at Passover. Yesterday was the official day of Passover. We're getting to the point where Jesus was going to be entering into Jerusalem for the second time and during Holy Week and facing the crucifixion. Was Jesus, if you look back at the description of Jesus, just an ordinary man as far as his appearance, was anyone expecting him to be their king? No. He didn't fit their vision of a king that was going to save them from their enemies. At that point, Rome and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the oppression that they were facing at the time. People weren't expecting the Messiah to be like Jesus. They expected him to be much more than that when it came to the physical and to be a kingly king. So we see that that's a great comparison for this week. So the ultimate lesson for tonight is that if we base our expectations solely on what we expect, we're going to be disappointed. We have to trust God. And so what does that look like? 4 things. First of all, we have to be willing to wait on God's timing. And in Psalm 40, verses 1 through 3, David says, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. We have to trust in God and wait on his timing. Second thing, we have to trust in the Lord's sovereignty. He is ultimately in control. And on your notes, I put First Colossians. There is no First Colossians. It's just Colossians. Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 through 17. It says, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things. In him all things hold together. And so we have to remember that he is ultimately in control of everything. We have to remember his sovereignty. Thirdly, we have to reflect on the Lord's attributes, his characteristics that have been the same since the beginning of God. There's no dead set time on that, but since the beginning, recorded history and oral history, anything that's been said about God, it's been unchanging. And we see some of those things recorded in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Those things have never changed and never will. God doesn't change. His attributes always stay the same. And in all the stuff that changes in our world, we can always count on God not to change. And the fourth thing, be filled with God's Spirit. And we see that mentioned, it's mentioned in many places. The verse I'm going to read from is from John chapter 14, verse 16. And it says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that's the Spirit, to be with you forever. Once the Spirit indwells in you, it is there forever. If you're willing to reach for it, if you're willing to sense it, if you're willing to acknowledge it, even if you don't do those things, it's still there. But you can activate it. You can retrieve it. It's there. It's meant to be there as a lifelong friend and companion to us. That helper is there. The last verse I want to share with you, and I encourage anyone, if you haven't already memorized this, to do so. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. He's been here since before time existed, and he's always going to be here. He's in control. He doesn't change. He fills us with his Spirit. And if we're willing to believe all of that and trust in his timing, we're going to come out of this okay. Is it scary? Sure. Do we like the uncertainty? No. But it is what it is, and we have to not focus on our circumstances, not focus, whether we're talking about the COVID-19 that we're all experiencing right now or some other trouble in your life. Most of us have recently either experienced problems with the health of our family members. We've experienced deaths in our family. We've experienced relationship issues, financial issues, and I could just keep going. Some type of trouble. So it doesn't just have to be because we're in this COVID-19 situation. Anytime you're in any trouble or struggle in your life, you can always go back to these four things: trusting in God and recognizing what that looks like. I was listening to a podcast the other night by Tony Evans, and I loved it. He said, devotion is not based on emotion. It's based on action. Our words and what we do are so powerful in convincing ourselves of our belief and reminding ourselves of the belief, but also letting others know that and letting us witness to others. So the question that I leave you with tonight is, what action will you take today to show your trust and devotion to God? So I hope tonight's message, you enjoyed the first week and the first lesson of our Trust and Faith series. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at David and see what he had to say, what happens with him. Most of us are at least somewhat familiar with David's story, and we're going to dive into it a little bit more. So I'm going to jump in, take a look at the comments, make sure I hadn't missed anything. So yeah, Brandy had asked earlier, so why did he give, why was it that he gave them the external, a man with the external features instead of the internal features? He gave them what they asked for. If you go back and you look, he said in chapter 8, verse 20, or the end of verse 19 and then into 20, he says, we want to have a king over us. We want to be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. They wanted that vision of that warrior king, and that's exactly what God gave them. He said, I'm going to give you what you asked for, because that's the only way you're going to learn your lesson. And we see that they had to learn. We're going to see in First and Second Kings as we study that they had to continue learning this lesson over and over and over again. And I think we can all kind of recognize with that, relate to that, because we don't often learn our lesson the first time. We have to be taught that over and over again. And Samuel went as far in earlier in chapter 8 and verse 10. He says, look, this is the way of the king. Once you have a king ruling over you, he's going to take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He's like, he's not going out before you in battle. He's going to send you all out to battle. And he winds up doing just that. So he needed to say, I'm going to give you what you wanted, just to prove that you don't know what you need. You may think you know what you want, but you don't know what you need. And they saw that in Saul. See if there were any other questions. Yeah. I think the question, that was the only one that I saw. Anybody else have any questions or any comments before we wrap up tonight? It's been nice that ones of you have been able to talk to on the phone, and a couple of people have dropped by. It's been good to see faces and to hear voices, so I certainly miss everyone, us being able to hang out together. Yeah, definitely. Some of us do learn the hard way. Yeah, and even those of us with hard heads, it hurts. And if it doesn't hurt you up here, it hurts you in here. Don't we hate it when our kids don't learn the lessons that we try to teach them? And we go, man, I've already told him that. Why can't he learn it? Imagine how God's feeling, because we're just as guilty of all of that as well. Yeah, and they did. They wanted someone to fight their battles for them, and they didn't feel like that God was that physical being that they could see fighting for them. And they just couldn't grasp that it was so much better to have this non-physical being that could be everywhere and know everything. They truly just didn't get it. And we're going to see that we still don't truly get it. We're still not waiting on God. We're still not trusting in God like we should. So next week we're going to pick up, we're going to touch on David's qualities, and we're going to look at some of his issues, both of obedience, the trials that he went through, even after he was anointed, but before he actually sat on the throne as king, what he had been through, and then what happened afterwards. And we're not just going to focus on the whole Bathsheba incident. There's so much more that we can study. So I hope this lesson resonated with someone, that you maybe got something out of it that you didn't get before, that reminded us that we do have to trust in God, and waiting. That's our biggest thing. And Miss Pat, I'm going to say it, we're just impatient, and we don't want to have that patience and endurance like we should. We just don't like to wait on the outcome. We think we want to be in control. We don't want to admit that we're trying to take control from God. But oftentimes that's exactly what we're saying is, look, I could do it faster, better than you could. I know what I need. But obviously we don't. If we're really honest about it, we don't. So unless there's any other questions or comments, I'll leave it there tonight. Stay in touch with everybody. We've had some prayer blasts go out. I'm not going to get into details on here because this does go public once I put it up on YouTube. But be praying for those that are not doing well health-wise, those that are just lonely right now, those that need some extra support, those that are dealing with kids at home, financial losses, and all of that we've heard throughout these last few weeks. So thank you all for your continued prayers for my family. And I hope that I can see you all again soon, whether it's here on Facebook Live, on our Zoom calls on Wednesday night, or just in passing. So you guys have a wonderful night. Be safe. Stay in prayer. Do your prayer journaling. Be in the scripture every day, and just continue to reach out for the support that you need. So I'll see you guys next week, and you guys have a wonderful, wonderful